Hi, I'm Stephanie Sebbing. Welcome to the Quilt Addicts Anonymous Block of the Month 2014 series. Today we're going to be making our February block. As you can see, we've got two color schemes, just like the month before. And you can really tell how your different fabric choices really make a difference. And there are instructions for two different sizes of triangles on here. One I like to call the glutton for punishment version, and then one is the I actually have a life and I'd like to get this finished version. Basically, same process for each one. They both finish the same size, just one has fewer triangles than the other, and all the cutting instructions and information for how many triangles you need to make and how big they are in the download that is available on Craftsy for this month's pattern. So basically we're just making a bunch of half square triangles, which is one of the easier units to make for this quilt. So we're going to start with some of the smaller half square triangles. We made these last month, but we'll do a little refresher for you here today. So I'm taking the light fabric that's going to be half of my triangle, and I'm going to make a mark from corner to corner. I'm using a marker so you can see it at home, but you just need to use a pencil, and it just needs to be dark enough so you can see it as you go through your sewing machine. So I'm going to take that and I'm going to lay it right sides together with the fabric that's going to be on the other half of the half square triangle. This block has a lot of seams in it, and every time you have a seam, you have a chance for your quarter inch seam to be off just a little bit. Even if you sew perfectly, when you press it open and you trim and things like that, sometimes it just doesn't turn out exactly a quarter inch. So what I found when piecing this block together, in order to get a true 12-inch finished block, is you have to piece it with a scant quarter inch. And to do that, set your machine up for a quarter inch stitch and then move your needle one position to the right. So if you're facing me, it's going to be your left, but when you're looking at the machine, it's just moving it one position over, and then you'll be able to sew a scant quarter inch when you are sewing these blocks together. So what I'm doing is I'm lining up the edge of my presser foot here with the line I've drawn. So I've got it right in line with that edge. So normally when you're sewing a quarter inch, you have your fabric line up here, but the edge of your fabric, but we're treating that line as the edge of our fabric. So I'm just going to go ahead and sew down. And you can chain piece these and do them all at once. And then when you're done, just turn it around and then line your presser foot up with the other side of that drawn line and sew all the way down. I recommend that you sew all your half square triangles at once and then cut them apart and then press them open and trim per block, and that helps break up the tedium because there are quite a few of these to make this month. I cut these apart. And I'm going to cut pretty close to that drawn line, but if I'm not completely right on top of it, that's all right. You just want to make sure that you do have a pretty good distance in between your sewn line and the edge of your fabric, because if it gets too skinny here, then that seam can pop open when you're on the long arm. So now I'm taking these over to my ironing surface, and I'm laying them with the dark side of the fabric up. And I'm going to set that seam, and to set it, you just lay your iron on top of it for a second or two. You don't have to put a lot of pressure on it or anything like that. That helps the thread lay nice and flat with the fabric. And this is a bias seam, so we got to treat it with a little respect. I open that up and press it down with my fingers first, and then I take the iron, I have it completely on the low side of the fabric, and then I just drag it up over the rest of that triangle. And you never want to set it directly on top of the fabric when you're pressing. Like, I wouldn't want to open this up, press it like that, and then just plop the iron right down on top of it, because that's when you have trouble with accuracy, because sometimes you might not press it completely open when you do that. And this is a bias seam, it can stretch, so just be careful at this point that you are being real careful with the seam to keep it nice and true and square. Now we have to square up our half square triangles. And this is an extra step, but it is really worth taking because it helps make sure that your blocks are going to come together absolutely accurately. Now, the size you're going to square it up to is different depending on which block pattern you are choosing, so make sure you follow the instructions for whichever block you chose to do. But what you want to look for, this one I'm squaring up to 2.5 inches. So I want to make sure that I have got fabric hanging off on either side of where I need to cut, and then on these sides here. And then the 45-degree line needs to be in line with your seam line, and that will ensure that your points are going to end up where they're supposed to be. So I'm just going to cut up and over, and then you can just move those out of the way. And then you turn it around, and the side that you cut, now you can line that up with your measurement that you're supposed to square it up to. So now I've got in line here, it's nice and square, and then I'm still checking that my 45-degree line is in line with that seam, and that'll make sure that those points will end up exactly where they're supposed to be when we put the entire block together. So like I said, when I put these together, I cut and prepare enough half square triangles for one block, and then I put one whole block together, and then I'll cut then and prepare the half square triangles for the next block. And that way it just breaks it up a little bit. You're not feel like you're trimming half square triangle blocks for hours on end, and it won't really take hours. It just will feel like it if you do them all at once. But by breaking it up, that kind of makes it seem like the project is going faster. So go ahead and do that for one block, and then come on back and we'll finish putting this block together. Alright, so I've got everything laid out here and ready to go. And just as a little tip, when you're making the large half square triangle, the process is exactly the same. Just when you're squaring it up, I recommend you use a 12.5 inch ruler, so that way you're able to see the entire triangle at once and make sure it's good and square, and that will, your block will turn out correctly as well. So I have all my triangles lined up, and again, the amount of triangles you have and the size of them is going to be different depending on which variation of the block you choose. So make sure you follow your own pattern instructions, find out how many half square triangles you need and what size they need to be at. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to sew one side together first and then the second side. And I'm going to start with this short side here. So I have an uneven number of half square triangles, and that is going to fit against this side of the large half square triangle. So what I do is I just lay them right sides together, and I'm going to have one extra because we're going to have to sew this one on separately because it won't have a pair to go with. So what I do is I grab the side that I folded it toward, and so I know I need to sew this side, and I always pinch the side that I need to sew so that I do not forget between when I grab them and when I come to sew them what needs to be sewn. Otherwise I will sew it to the wrong side, and it's very easy to happen. So I've got it set down, so I just have to pick them up and then bring them to my presser foot. So I've got the side I need to sew right in line with that. And again, I'm using a scant 1/4 inch seam to construct this entire block to help ensure that it comes out nice and square. So I'm just going to chain piece these. It goes pretty quickly that way. When you're done, you can just snip those threads apart. Chain piecing helps save time and thread, and since thread is expensive, that's always something that is good to save on. So now we've got to press these open. So I'm laying them down so that the dark side is up. I don't want to have this light side up because then there's going to be a shadow on that's visible when your quilt is put together because that dark fabric will show through. So I'm setting my seam. And this one is really important to press open with your fingers first because this point is not going to want to press open. There's a lot of resistance there because there's a couple extra seams in that section. So if you press that flat with your fingers first, then you're not going to end up with a block that kind of waves to the side. It'll be nice and rectangular the way you want it. So go ahead and do that for both of those. like that. And now I can sew these two together. So you don't have to go lay it back down next to the block. We know that all the triangles need to be going in the same direction. So you can just lay them down at your pressing surface. Make sure everything's facing the right or the same way. And then you can put them right sides together and just bring it right over to the sewing machine. And we're going to sew that next seam together. So we've got to press this one open again too. And again, we go through the process of setting the seam, and then I'm going to press that open with my fingers first to help make sure that that point goes where it needs to go. And then I usually hold the iron over it, again, just to help keep those seams nice and flat. And I've grabbed our fifth and final triangle, and we're going to add that to. It really doesn't matter what side you add it to because it's all going to be the same size in the end. So now we're just going to add that fifth and final triangle. And again, depending on how many or which block you're doing, you might have more than 5 triangles, so don't worry if you do. And then I just get to sew this, and then I got one whole side done and ready to go. So this block actually goes together pretty quickly, even though it looks like there's a lot of pieces to it. So now I've got that piece that we just sewed together lined up, and as you can see, it's the same width as our large triangle that we've cut. And so if you want, you can sew this together now, or what I'm going to do, and this is what I recommend doing, is sewing your other side together as well. So here you are going to have an even amount because we're going to sew that corner on as part of it as well. And so again, I'm just flipping my triangles, right sides together, and then I'm grabbing the side that I need to sew the seam on, and I'm going to pinch that and bring it right over to my sewing machine so I don't mess up and accidentally sew the wrong side of the triangle and have to rip. So now what you're going to do is you're just going to put it through the process again. Go ahead and sew your scant 1/4 inch seam, press them open, and sew them all together so that you have one long row of even number of half square triangles. So what I've done now is I've sewn this row with the even number of half square triangles together. And I've done one thing differently. You can't tell from the front side, but when you flip it over, you can see that I pressed all my seams so that they are underneath the dark fabric of the half square triangles, except for the one that's going to be down in this corner. And there will be a shadow there, but it's going to make it a lot easier to get all these points to come together nicely and have all the points end up where they're supposed to be. And that's what people are going to be looking at more than whether or not there's a shadow right here. So go ahead and do that for yours as well. So this is the first time that I'm going to pin to put these together. So I'm putting it right sides together. And I'm going to line up my corners first and just put a little pin in there. And then do the same thing on the other side. And I don't really like to pin. I try to avoid it as much as possible, but there are certain times when it's necessary, and this is one of them. So I'm putting one in the center, and then at about 1/4 of the way through each block as well. And I find that it's easier to keep all these points where they're supposed to be when you're sewing them together. You actually don't pin right in that seam line because that kind of creates a little bit of a buckle, and if you don't have a pin there, then it lies a little flatter when you're sewing together. So again, I have my sewing machine set up for a scant 1/4 inch seam, and that really allows you to get everything to come out exactly the way it's supposed to for this block. And I do slow down when I get to the seam allowances and just give it a little tug or a push here and there to make sure that it's in line with the side of the large half square triangle. And if you want to use your hand to guide it up front, that's fine. Just make sure you're not pulling on it because you don't want to stretch your fabric out of sorts. We're getting to the end here. We just have to press this open and add one more side to this block. So I have this set up so that way the wrong side of the large half square triangle is facing toward me. And I'm going to set that seam to help the thread lay nice and flat with the fabric. And then I'm going to open this up, and that will ensure that the seam is underneath this long part of the half square triangle, because it's the path of least resistance, because it would be really difficult to press all of these points going in the opposite direction. So I'm going to lay my iron down on the low side of the fabric and just drag it up like that. And see how trimming the half square triangles to size and then also sewing with that scant 1/4 inch seam really helps all these points end up exactly where they're supposed to be. So taking those extra steps really makes a big difference in the final product of your quilting. To the final step, we've got to attach one more side here. I'm going to lay that right sides together, and this is where pressing that one corner going in the opposite direction will really help you, because right now I have my seams going in 2 different ways, so this is going to lay nice and flat. You shouldn't feel a bump or a gap, it should just feel nice and flat as you put those together. So what I'm doing is I am pinning in what is my right side of the seam. And so that way when you sew, we're going to sew down to here, stop our needle when it is in this part of the seam, and then finish sewing. So now for this part, I'm going to line up corner to corner at the top, a little pin in there. And just like we did the other side, I'm going to put a pin in the center of the block, and then about 1/4 of the way down, just to keep everything nice and lined up as we're going through and sewing that. All right, so I leave this pin in until I get it situated underneath the presser foot, and then the presser foot will keep it in place for me. And I'm just sort of taking pins out as I get to them. You never want to sew over a pin. You can break your needle, and that can actually get pretty dangerous. If you want to stop, if you feel more comfortable stopping before you get to the pin, go ahead and do that. Now I just kind of keep going until I get to where those seam allowances are. And I stop with my needle down in the seam allowance before I come to the pin, and then that needle acts as a pin, keeping the seam nice and secure, so that way I'm going to have a real good point at the end. So now before I keep going again, I'm just going to real quick line up my corners down at the bottom, and I'm just going to hold that in place with my pointer finger. And then I align my middle finger up with the side of the presser foot and just use that as a guide to help keep that seam nice and true all the way to the end. So we just have to press this open, and then we're ready to go. So again, we want the path of least resistance. We don't want to press open against all those points. So again, I've got the wrong side of the large half square triangle up, and I'm setting those seams. Then I'm just going to open up that block, and I'm going to use my fingers to help press that open first, because we are, it's a lot of triangles. It's really easy to stretch this block out if you're not careful. I'm going to start pressing that open. And this seam here, there's a lot of bulk in there because there's a lot of seams coming together. So you may have to spend some extra time with the iron over this corner seam and then over this point seam here as well. But see how everything has really come together real nicely because we took the time to make sure that these seams were pressed in the opposite direction, and then we sewed with our scant 1/4 inch seam. And one thing I'd like to point out, your edges are going to have about 1/4 of an inch where it looks like the point didn't come together correctly. But that is all going to get taken care of when we sew the quilt all together, because this is the seam allowance. So once we actually sew that together, those points are going to come out perfectly. So thank you for following along with the Quilt Addicts Anonymous 2014 Block of the Month series. Make sure you go to quiltaddictsanonymous.com/block of the month, and then you'll be able to find patterns and instructions for all of these patterns. They're for free. You get to download them. And make sure you come back and show us what your block looked like using the link sharing tool at the bottom of the post for February. Thanks so much. I'm Stephanie Sebbing, and happy quilting.